Hi guys, and the last installment of our Weathering Soil and Erosion trilogy is erosion. And now we're going to talk about how that weathered rock is moved. So remember, weathering is that mechanical or that chemical breakdown of rock into soil. And now we're going to talk about how that soil or weathered rock is moved and what are the mechanisms or means in which they are moved. Maybe. All right, there we go. So what is erosion exactly? So erosion is going to be defined as the removal of rocks and soil by wind, water, ice, and also gravity. We talked a little bit about the soil movement of gravity in the last lecture from landslides, avalanche, and those sorts of means. But now we're going to go into it a little bit more. So wind, water, ice, and gravity are also known as those agents or the mechanisms of erosion. So how that soil and rock get moved. So we have wind, water, and also ice in the form of glaciers. If you remember from the first lecture, we talked about water being the most destructive in terms of being able to move that rock and soil. So what is the relationship between weathering and erosion? So weathering is going to involve two processes. So we talked about those. The physical, which is going to change maybe the size of the rock, but it's not going to change its composition, whereas chemical weathering is going to change the chemical makeup of the rock. Okay, it's going to turn it into something else. So the example that we saw was the oxidation, where we see iron in the presence of oxygen being turned into that iron oxide. So again, these two processes are going to work together to break down that rock into soil. Both processes occur in the same place. There's no movement at all involved in weathering. Okay, so we see this happening basically stationary. Nothing's moving. But in erosion, we are seeing the movement of that rock and soil. So the first type of erosion that we're going to talk about is wind erosion. So wind can play a role by carrying that material. So sand and clay, and the reason why sand and clay is because they're not as heavy, okay? So it's going to pick it up from one place to another. As the wind blows, it's going to pick up those small particles of sand or sediment, and it's going to blast those large rocks, okay? Cutting and scraping. So again, erosion can be determined by four things, and you're going to see this throughout the lecture as well. Now, the greater the amount of either one of these things, the higher the erosion rate is going to be. So we can see the amount of sand with the speed, okay, the speed of the wind. The greater the speed of the wind, the greater our rate of erosion. Slope. Okay, so how steep is something? So we can see erosion and more surface area as well. So all of those are going to play a role. Remember, we talked about surface area in the first. So the greater the surface area, the greater the exposure to the weathering or the erosion. Okay, so that rate's going to go up because of that. So here's just some examples of wind erosion. Okay, the movement of sediment, rock sediment, or soil by the force of wind. The next type of erosion we're going to talk about is water erosion. So when rain falls to the earth, it can evaporate, which is one part of the water cycle, sink into the ground, become part of a reservoir, or flow over the land as runoff. Okay, so all of those things are part of the water cycle. So when it flows over land, erosion is going to occur. And as the water runs off, it's going to pick up sediment. It might also pick up other things as well. But in this case, we're only really concerned about those, about the rock sediment. And then as it does this, it's going to run downhill and it's going to create tiny grooves, again, creating more surface area for erosion. So there are four. How much erosion takes place by water is, again, going to be determined by these four factors. So we have the sum, the amount of water. A greater amount of water is going to occur in a greater rate of erosion. Slope, okay, it's going to run faster The higher the slope, the greater the speed. And then also, as time goes on, the greater the surface area. So again, the more exposure to the erosive force, that means that it's going to have a higher rate of erosion. So here's just some examples of water erosion. So you can kind of see a great example is going to be things like canyons, the Grand Canyon. Now, obviously, these occur over millions of years, but there are other water or another examples of where a water can erode something very quickly. And you talked about it in the past too, that trees, they're going to minimize that rate of erosion. So when we see like new communities coming in, or we see things like wetlands being destroyed, these are all going to prevent water having that erosive property. And so when those things aren't present, then we don't see that higher rate. So here's just some examples of water erosion. The next type we're going to talk about is ice erosion from glaciers. So glaciers are going to wear down the landscape. They are able to pick up and carry debris, and they're going to be able to move them over very long distances. Now, think about how large a glacier is, and as it moves along, what it's capable of moving. So it moves like a conveyor belt, and as it does, it can move millions of tons of material, which is a great amount. Again, how much erosion takes place is going to be determined by the sum of the glacier. Remember, glaciers are massive and they're able to move large amounts of material. Again, slope, speed, and then the surface area. All of these have a great relationship. So one plays into the other. So here's some examples of glacial erosion. And remember, these are large mass, and they'll actually shear off rocks and then move them. They can move them miles and miles. The last one's gravity erosion, and we kind of touched on this a little bit when we talked about the formation of soil. So this is that mass movement. So again, transfer of rock by gravity. So we talked about them. Creeps, remember, that's going to be that slow movement of soil. Then we have landslides, rock falling, slumps, avalanches. These are all going to be rapid movements. Remember, creep movements are actually going to account for a larger mass of soil and rock sediment being moved. So even though we can see these with our eyes and it's much more visual to us, the creep is actually doing much more damage. So again, those rock slides, mudslides, avalanche, here's that example of that creep where the side of the mountain is being moved, but at a very slow rate. So how does this affect us? It's kind of a good question to ask. So humans are constantly influencing nature and the landscape. So houses, roads, buildings, developments, canals, they're all going to change the shape and the appearance of the land. And when we're doing this, we also can cause many of these erosive properties to happen. And so a lot of times now, we are much more aware of what we're doing, and we try to prevent these things from happening. So you might see retaining walls, you might see vegetation being planted. And so it's important that we try to leave as small of a footprint as possible. All right, and that is the end of that. If you guys have any questions, just make sure and get a hold of me, and I will help you as best as I can. Thanks, guys.